Good afternoon. I feel incredibly tall. I think usually, well, anyway, doesn't matter. I think usually the podium is next to the thing, so this is a different setup. I'm Carla Coppell, and I'm a vice president here at U.S. Institute of Peace, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon for what I know will be a terrific conversation around the role of communities in resisting violence and conflict. I have to say, when I was looking at the work of our wonderful group of speakers and preparing for the conversation this afternoon, it made me think back to a visit I took to speak with a group of Syrians who had come out of Syria into southern Turkey and Gaziantep, and were telling the most incredible stories of how they had negotiated successfully at a community level to get ISIS to leave schools so that they could reopen their schools, how they had worked with community members to maintain and reopen bakeries because in their part of the world, the maintenance of the local manufacturer of bread was critical to enabling communities to stay in place, notwithstanding conflict. And so having that bread and that bread production was critical. And it made me think that how much commonality there is around the world, though we won't be focused today on Syria, that there are communities all around the world who are really striving to create space, notwithstanding war and conflict. And so I'm eager to hear how the discussion unfolds, and it was a great pleasure to read Oliver's work and analysis from Colombia. For those who are interested, I am told that we should be tweeting using hashtag #PeoplePowerForPeace. We are recording the conversation, and it is being cast as well, webcast as well. So greetings to those who are viewing online. And what we're going to do is have a series of opening remarks from our panelists, and then we're going to turn it for a discussion. And so I'm going to invite our four esteemed speakers up to the stage. Oliver Kaplan, who has just concluded as a senior fellow with USIP and is it concluded formally? I don't know. As assistant professor, the Corbell School of International Studies, the University of Denver. Mauricio Garcia, who's executive director of Jesuit Refugee Services in Colombia. Amanda Sanchez, who's senior associate for the Andes for the Washington Office on Latin America. And Steve Pomper, who just today begins work as the director of U.S. programs with Crisis Group and was a senior policy scholar until, was that Friday? Yeah. Friday with the U.S. Institute of Peace, and really look forward to a robust conversation. So take it away, Oliver.
Great. Thank you, Carla, and welcome everybody. It's great to have you here. And I just want to say that I'm really grateful for the opportunity to spend time here at the U.S. Institute of Peace. It's really an amazing place, and one thing I've noticed is it has really an amazing culture of gratitude, and it's been just really a great experience being here. But peacemakers, go figure that they have this great culture of gratitude, so wonderful. I'd just like to say a few thank yous before I get into some formal remarks. I'd like to thank the whole Nonviolent Action team here at USIP, including Maria Stephan, who couldn't be here today, and especially Tabitha Thompson, who played a really critical behind-the-scenes role in helping get this event together, as well as the USIP's Public Affairs Office. I'd also like to just note that USIP's Colombia work is synonymous with Ginny Bouvier, and her inspirational work and early reports really validated my early steps and kept me going as a student working on this project. Thinking that if someone from USIP really believes in a topic, it must be worth pursuing. And she is sorely missed, and we honor her by continuing the struggle for peace and justice, and I know that she would be very pleased about us coming together today. And I just want to say it's great to see so many friendly faces in the audience, and I really appreciate you coming to celebrate this project with me and digesting it. It really means a lot. It's been a long road, and it's nice that this project is seeing the light of day. I'd like to welcome some current and former students from the Corbell School at the University of Denver who are here. Great to see you. And I'd also like to just note that in this project, I had to take on a lot of debts of gratitude to colleagues and student research assistants and many other people who gave input from around the world. So I'm really thankful to people in Colombia, the Philippines, and elsewhere who shared their time and insights during the research. And so I'd also just like to give a brief welcome to the panelists who are here. Mauricio and I were friends from the beginning of the project, and it's always good to know that you have a Jesuit in your corner. Mauricio has accompanied a lot of communities, and he said to me early on if I was ever in any trouble to give him a call, and he would come for me. And I'm really glad I never needed him, except for now, and I'm really glad you came, so thank you, Mauricio, for coming up from Colombia. We also have Amanda Sanchez, and I've really admired Jimena's work and advocacy and commitment from afar, and I'm humbled to learn from her expertise and reflections. And Steve, I recently met here as we were both fellows at USIP, and I can't think of anyone better to consider the broader implications of this research for violence prevention. And so really I know that the expertise on stage and also our expertise in the audience is really humbling, so it's great to have you all here. So I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes just to give an overview of the argument and some of the findings, because I know, well, most of you probably have read the book, but maybe a few of you haven't read it yet, which, you know, as a professor, I won't take too much offense at, but I thought I would just give an overview so that people sort of understand a bit about where the book is coming from. And so the book deals with the puzzle of how civilians protect themselves when caught between armed groups. And civilians face problems of things like the fog of war, where identities are vague, as well as things like the law of silence, where civilians are so afraid that they don't talk or cooperate with each other. And yet, while we often focus on violence and victims, many victims have also, or many people have also survived. And so to start, I'd like to just go and contrast the experiences of two villages from a case study that appear in the book, the villages of La India and Saint-Tropez, which are both in Colombia. And in 1998, in the village of Saint-Tropez, paramilitary forces brutally executed 12 woodcutters in this village. And yet just a short time later, in 2001, this same group was preparing to kill 11 residents of La India, but they didn't, because a community organization that had formed there, known as the Peasant Workers Association, came to their defense and advocated on their behalf, and these 11 people lived. And this is really fascinating and raises a puzzle. How are communities like La India able to act? And more broadly, how common are these actions? And how can we tell whether they affect violence? So that's really where this book comes down. This is a real puzzle because it's not obvious that unarmed civilians in civil wars can protect themselves nonviolently against heavily armed combatants, and yet we see cases where they do. So to study this question was a bit difficult since community actions are often hidden and occur in rural areas where the conflict plays out. And so to study the question, I really had to get out there and go to different villages and small communities and try to understand people's daily life and how they dealt with the conflict. And so in Colombia, this meant taking quite a variety of forms of transportation, including what are known as chivas, or country buses, which are basically a bus put on top of a Mack truck, jeeps, or as Colombians refer to them, willies, motorcycles, bestias, or beasts or mules, lanchas, or motor canoes, and actually some unbelievably steep hikes in mud boots, which were quite exhausting. I also did a little bit of field work in the Philippines and include some case study analysis of cases from Syria and Afghanistan as well. So I want to just go over the main argument in very simple terms. The main argument posits that as civilians organize, they can implement nonviolent strategies, and these strategies will lead to, in some cases, reductions in violence. And I want to just read a short quote about the importance of organization. This was a time when I attended a church service with members of actually the Peasant Workers Association, who were quite organized. And I sort of saw this in full relief when I was at the service. So I'm just going to read a couple sentences here. As the service began, the people sang hymns and read along from the prayer book. I quickly lost my place, however, so I quietly nudged my companion, an elder conciliator from the community, to ask him where we were. So as not to disturb the songs, he whispered, "I don't know." Since he was following along and skimming the pages with his finger, I quizzically asked, "What do you mean you don't know?" And he looked over at me sheepishly, shrugged his shoulders, and said, "I don't read." And so this was really a fascinating moment where I realized that this person, who was an extremely humble, humble means humble background, was part of this really powerful community organization, and that as these kinds of people could organize, it gave them the capacity to confront violence. And so, in that community, some of the nonviolence norms that they were organized on came from the Adventist church, and sort of being in that environment and hearing that response was really striking and really underscored the importance of organization. And so really what that organization does is it creates power where there is no power. And so it gives communities an internal management capacity. And I look at two types of organizations. Around the world, we see things like formal peace organizations, such as the Peasant Workers Association. Actually, this is a picture from 2013. And we also see other less formal organizations. And in Colombia, I look at what are known as junta councils or village councils. And these kinds of councils we see in a lot of places around the world. And those, in the case of Colombia, these are locally elected councils that historically had inconsistent contact with the state, but helped with public goods planning, and later came to take on protective roles. One example where I saw this was studying the case of the towns of Vianney and Bituima in the Department of Cundinamarca, where I did some field research. And in this town, I discovered that a very proactive priest in the early 1960s helped stimulate collective action in the community after the church roof collapsed. And based on that, he organized people to help rebuild the church. And what he told me when I actually met him in Bogota when he was in his late 80s was that sort of showed to him that it was possible to organize around other issues as well, and it left a lasting legacy of community organization. And this came to be very important when the conflict arrived. And so when I interviewed residents, they told me various stories about how important this community capacity was. One man said in a quite funny quote, "United we move ahead, alone we're screwed." So, para adelante cuando unidos, solos jodidos. And, it sort of speaks to the broader power of organization of these village councils, that they see them as so important. So, that picture didn't quite come out. This was going to actually, I'll skip back to some of the strategies we see here on the cover. So the main thing I look at in terms of nonviolent strategies is how civilians advocate for their own autonomy or self-rule. And I look at different strategies so that communities can rule their own communities, including managing what type of violence is visited on a community. And I look at really approximately 6 principal strategies that I identified in my research: covert actions, such as internal strategies of managing the community, and these include things like norms or a culture of peace, mechanisms for dispute resolution so disputes don't reach armed actors, and early warning systems. And then I also identify what I call overt strategies or external-facing strategies. And these include things like investigation mechanisms to clarify the fog of war and halt threats by armed actors against members of the community, dialogue, and also protest. And one of the sort of latent strategies that some communities also take is arming, so sort of local self-defense. And I actually don't study that so much because the book is largely about nonviolence, but it's a strategy that occurs and should be acknowledged. So, let me just skip ahead to where we were. Okay. So one example of one of these strategies I saw in the Philippines is that some communities known as peace zones have mounted efforts to ban weapons from their communities. So you could think of this as community-led gun control, keeping armed actors from entering the communities with weapons. Another strategy is protests, and so in Colombia this happens quite a bit when armed actors convene communities to try to get them to submit to their will, and they often will hold these meetings in places like the community polideportivo, or the multi-sport court, which is sort of the largest space in a community where you see things like soccer and basketball all played in the same space. And in these cases where communities were organized, it was more likely to see some kind of protest calling out the armed groups for their efforts to repress the community. And these would often exacerbate divisions within the ranks of armed actors, and in some cases pull on their reputational concerns. So the book also has some statistical analysis about how these community organizations are correlated with violence, and I just want to show one single graph here, which is sort of the core result from this analysis, which shows that where communities are more organized, you see on average a 25% reduction in forms of selective violence. And so this was based on a much messier regression analysis, but it sort of speaks to the effect of these village councils. So where you have higher levels of village councils, you see less, on average, less violence. And so why might this be? This is a difficult question to answer, but as part of the research, I interviewed ex-combatants to understand why their groups took the decision to use violence or not, and how is that conditioned on community capacity and the nonviolent strategies that civilians use. And so I'll just have a couple of quotes that I think were really enlightening. One quote was from a FARC subcommander that I interviewed, a former FARC subcommander, who said an adage that's either Shakespeare or Aristotle, I'm not quite sure which one, but the quote is, "A single swallow does not make a summer." And that's sort of to imply that a single individual alone won't have so much effect or influence, but a whole group of people, a flock of swallows, is something that the armed group has to take into account and can't ignore. And so that community organization to implement nonviolent strategies really figures in their thinking, according to that quote. Paramilitary groups actually made similar quotes, and there's a quote from community minutes that I had access to when they had meetings with armed groups. They were taking notes word for word, and one of the quotes that a paramilitary said is to a community that was sort of trying to inquire about whether they could defend their autonomy and not have paramilitary influence. One of the paramilitaries said, "If it's the entire community that wants it, we would respect the decision. But if it's only 2 or 3 people that don't want us, we will stay here. We will continue to be in the community." And again, they voiced things like reputational concerns and moral concerns. And so I'm just going to wrap up with this nice picture of the horizon for some final thoughts, and then I'm happy to turn it over to the panelists. And so one thing that I think is really interesting, especially what we're seeing in Colombia today, is that a lot of these communities that organized actually ended up outlasting a lot of the armed actors. And this was underscored in a journal entry actually of a leader from the Peasant Workers Association, where when I looked at these records, he wrote the following: "To you that wanted violence, this ended in shit, for the right to life, peace, and work." And so you can see there's quite a humorous undertone to some of these quotes, and the Spanish version I think is even maybe a bit funnier and actually rhymes. So I think that's a really important point, that these communities should be taken seriously because they've had these lasting effects and they've survived quite long periods of violence. And so just to wrap up, I think the goal with this work was to try to translate what people were doing who don't necessarily have voices and aren't always heard, to explain to others how they did things and how they survived the difficult years of conflict. And I think if I got halfway there doing that, I'll be happy and I'll take it. A final thought that a number of the local peacemakers that I've interacted with have said is that peace is an everyday process, or that every day, especially in conflict zones, we need a continual effort to work toward peace, to promote pro-peace norms of nonviolent action, and make sure that people remember these ways of behaving. And I think that implication stands true for Afghanistan and Syria and other countries. I think the main takeaway is that there are tools that civilians have innovated that we need to understand, and we could think about what if we invested more in the importance of civilian peacemakers. And so, in short, I think we should look to civilians as a source of peace. Thank you, and I'm happy to turn it over now to our panelists.
Thank you so much, Oliver. And I should have started, I think, by saying congratulations on publication of Resisting War. And thank you as well for a sort of quick and concise summary of the case that it's making. And sort of with that as our starting point for the conversation, I'm going to turn now to Mauricio for his comments on the frame that Oliver has provided and give his observations and thoughts.
Thank you. Well, it's impossible to start speaking without having in memory Jeannie Bouvier. The last time I was in USIP many years ago was in a panel organized by her. And we really in Colombia are in debt with all her contribution to building peace in the country. She was really amazing. She was connected with everyone in all social levels, in all regions of the country. It's an amazing memory. I still remember the moment in 2007 when Oliver Kaplan entered to my office at CINEP asking for help in his doctoral research about the way communities in the midst of the conflict resisted to the armed actors. This was the initial contact of a long-term connection and collaboration between us. When I was researching for my PhD thesis on the peace movement in Colombia, I used categories that were applied to the peace movements in Europe and in the US, but always adapting and adjusting them to the reality of a country with an ongoing armed conflict. Specifically, I took categories used by John Loveland to see the types of strategies deployed in the peace movement in the US, basically 4 of them: educating, protesting, organizing, and politicking. In the Colombian case, one more emerged given the importance of the resisting dynamic of the population in relation to the armed actors. So I introduced it in my research and in the Collective Action for Peace database. Nevertheless, the focus of my PhD dissertation was not only civil resistance, but also the whole peace mobilization in the country. In the Colombian context, we have lived an academic paradox. There is an amazing volume of work concerning situations of multi-plural violence that plagues the country, but a poor contribution of explicit and critical studies of the peace and resisting initiatives to war. In this sense, clearly we can say that the work of Oliver Kaplan is a meaningful contribution to fill the gap existing in the academic world on Colombia, but also elsewhere, related with civil resistance in war times. Thank you, Oliver, for this contribution. Oliver worked in unraveling the complex reality of resisting as civilian actors in the midst of an armed conflict, showing their capacity for agency and autonomy. This is not a black and white situation where you have a clear path to resist armed actors, but it's really a continuum that ranges from a total opposition to complete capitulation to the armed actor. This is to say that resisting is a gray area of interactions among civilians, population, and armed actors. In this sense, and I want to highlight the methodological approach used by Kaplan because it combines not only quantitative and qualitative methods, historical sources of data, and qualitative fieldwork, but also it looks the way to respond to the complexity of civil resistance in the midst of an armed conflict, with several differences and particularities depending on the regional context, the moment of the conflict, and the armed actors involved. Oliver Kaplan paid special attention to grasp the specific attitudes of the armed actors towards civilians. I can confirm from my own experience of working with displaced population in a very conflicted regions that at least two important issues emerge related with this relationship of the armed actors with the communities. The first one is the image they have of the civilian population. Is if they see them as a collaborators or if they see them as enemies. There is an incredible story I have with the paramilitaries. One time we were working with the peace communities in the Bajo Atrocity River, and we used to have church agents. We used to go to speak with all the armed actors, and we see the guerrillas, we see the paramilitaries, we see the army, and we try to keep the situation looking for security for the communities. One time we were with Carlos Castaño, was a leading man in the paramilitary groups, and we were with the peace community leaders, and they presented to him the community and what was the purpose, what they were doing, and when they finished to speak, Castaño said, well, if what you say is really true, you are the most interesting experience of counter-revolutionary work. In the sense, he felt that the communities were not affecting the work they were doing, or the presence of the paramilitaries in the region, and was possible to negotiate some security issues related with the communities because they can see the situation in that way. The other issue that are important for the armed actors is the territory dispute. Who control the territory and how strategic is that territory? This is a key issue that Oliver mentioned in the book, in the research. And in this sense, I had a few bad experience with the guerrillas, to be honest, in the sense that obviously FARC was in the midst of the population, in many cases was connected with the population, with family and so on. But the mechanism for social control of the communities was the presence of militias, of milicianos, within the communities. And the crazy thing was to keep this working, they used selective killings in order to maintain the communities a complete loyalty to the armed group. And there was a way of keeping, maintaining, and we have to move in this complexity. And also, we have experience with the militaries, because given that they don't have a continuous presence in the territory, people feel them more as an occupation force that's a really ally of the communities. So there were tensions with sometimes I remember one time that a commander of of the Navy asked me, well, Father, why people don't support us? They don't sell us fish, they don't sell us banana plantain, they don't sell us other things. And I remember I told them, well, you arrive and you go later. And people have to keep here facing the armed actors. So if you will stay here and protect, really protect and give security to the communities, they will support you, but not in this way. I give this example to show the complexity of negotiating security, negotiating protection, negotiating autonomy of the communities in the midst of different armed actors. How communities protect themselves, question that Oliver tried to respond in the book, is crucial in the work we do in GRS with population forced to displace. In addition to the humanitarian support we give to the displaced population, we also work in preventing new displacements. One critical issue is the topic of civilian agency, specifically how to empower communities and their capacity for resilience so that they can resist the pressure of the armed actors in the regions where they live without having to flee and migrate. Our accompaniment to people in these circumstances could be enriched with many of the elements that Oliver has found in his research in Colombia. For instance, organized community, acted in a collective and non-violent way, have greater resilience to armed actors than those who are not. The tactical repertoire they can use is clearly described by Kaplan in chapter 2. It's a very interesting that this type of research, or this type of approach to the civil resistance could have a very practical support in the work we are doing. Because despite the peace agreement with FARC, there are still violence in Colombia. And we are facing the challenge to support communities that are still in the midst of the conflict. So a reflection like Oliver Kaplan has done in the book is really useful for us and help us to develop and to train people and to help people to empower themselves in order to be able to resist in a civil and non-violent way in their own land.
Thank you so much for those comments. I have to admit, when you were very early, when you were talking about the willingness of the community to engage with you, made me think very early in my career I was working in the Philippines, and there was insurgent activity in the communities where I was working, and I said, well, you know, should I be concerned? Is there a time I need to leave? And the community said, no, we've talked to them. They know you're okay. You can go ahead. I said, all right, I guess I'm taking your word for it.
It's true.
Yeah, no, they know their insurgent movements and what the situation is. Yeah, so very interesting. Jimena.
Good afternoon. I'm Amanda Sanchez, and I work for the Washington Office on Latin America, an independent non-governmental organization based in Washington that basically monitors U.S. foreign policy towards the region. And we've been very privileged to develop a series of partnerships with many of these resistance and peace communities throughout the years, and been able to facilitate their access to U.S. policymakers to help further their agenda. Ginny Bouvier is sorely missed. She was somebody who was always incredibly supportive of these communities that in some respects were not very well liked by a lot of people because of the fact that they refused to follow one political agenda or the other. So I think she'd be happy to see that what is being done today and continuing. And I think that Oliver's book is incredibly important because the history in Colombia is not just the violence, the massacres, the horrible things that took place during the conflict and that ending, but also the resistance of many different civilians throughout that time who were able to negotiate and navigate in the midst of an incredibly complex security situation. And it's that civil society, those civilians and resistance movements that are really going to build the democracy in Colombia now in the post-conflict, especially in some of the most remote areas. So everyone knows Colombia is very unique in the sense that there's a formal Colombia, and then there's the actual Colombia. It's a country with one of the highest displaced populations in the world, and with the most advanced legislation to address displaced people, considered a model by everyone, but it's also one of the places where security is least implemented for displaced people and civilians. And among those displaced and are specific groups, mostly rural populations and Afro-descendants and indigenous people. We've seen that throughout the conflict in Colombia, or the conflicts in Colombia, especially the longest standing one with the FARC, civilians have taken on different forms to resist. And these have different names, like peace communities, you have spaces for peace, you have urban peace spaces, you have humanitarian corridors, and then you've also had the development of nonviolent guards to try and keep the peace, especially among ethnic groups. What are these basically? They're basically self-protection strategies, and they're based on international humanitarian law. Basically, what these civilians have done is taken the notion of international humanitarian law and made it a reality in different parts of the country by interpreting it to their situation and scenario, and using that as their credibility in order to prevent being harmed and being able to advance. And so theoretically, international humanitarian law, in particular the principle of distinction between civilians and non-civilians, the concept that there are certain spaces that can't be occupied by different armed groups because that places people in jeopardy, and then the UN guiding principles on internal displacement, which are extrapolated from humanitarian law as well as human rights law, combined have been basically what these communities have used as their political basis. How does it work? Well, basically, you have designated spaces that the community determines are areas where none of the armed groups, both legal and illegal, can come into the space, because in Colombia, groups were always being, the fight basically was through civilians. You saw not as much direct combat in a lot of these rural communities as much as you would see groups trying to fish out the militias or folks who they thought were basically supporting the other group. And so by creating that space, you have first more of a guarantee that these groups are not going to basically stigmatize that whole community as one way or the other, or say that they're collaborators. So you would have that actual physical space. Then you would have the development of a culture within that community of peace, which also included in many rural communities their own self-education system, because these areas were so insecure that teachers did not want to teach there, or so poor that the state really didn't reach those areas. And in the case of Afro-descendant communities, you also had within that context what is known as ethno-education. So basically a whole educational curriculum based on the type of society they wanted to live in versus what was really what they were living in. You also had rules often, such as, all weapons are banned, alcohol, drugs were banned, and all of this was very much enforced by a specific council or grouping of elected people in the community. But basically it was every member of that community committing to these principles and watching out for the others to make sure that there was coherence. And really, the more coherent the communities, the least they suffered in terms of violence, although they weren't completely immune to it. This was accompanied by political accompaniment. So national organizations in Colombia would physically be present in those areas, would basically document the situation and alert the world and all the institutions about what was going on, and also help with legal cases to further justice in these situations. So you have the communities like in the Bajo Atrato of Cavida, which were basically displaced Afro-Colombians that found themselves in a situation in an urban setting after 1996, where thousands of people were forced to flee due to a paramilitary military operation called Operation Genesis throughout the whole region, to a situation of complete desperation where they saw that in urban areas they could not survive. They did not have the skills, they were discriminated against for being Afro-descendant and for being from rural areas, and they decided, we're just going to go back and we're going to try to live within that context. You have spaces like the urban space in Buenaventura, Puente Nayero, which is basically one street, and now they're trying to open it up to 2 streets where paramilitaries cannot go in. And Buenaventura, an area where there have been some very disturbing practices, such as the chop-up houses by some of these illegal armed groups, became an area, this space, where such houses were closed down, and within that area, people could actually, beyond security, also start to cultivate different community activities that they weren't able to do before out of fear. You have the famous San Jose de Apartado Peace Community, which is another example of this place. Anyhow, during the Álvaro Uribe Vélez years, unfortunately, part of the attitude of the Colombian government was to promote something called democratic security policy that basically erased the notion of distinction between civilians and non-civilians, and many of these communities, they were throughout the entire country, weren't able to survive through that. But some did, and the ones that did formed a network in the country that is called Compas, that basically went on to become a collective political voice and had a lot of input into different issues having to do with victims, transitional justice, and reintegration and so forth during the peace process. At the same time, you also have urban groups, mostly IDP groups with other self-protection mechanisms. And you've had the indigenous resistance movement, which is the Guardia Indígena, which basically the concept there is if an armed group is coming in to do something they shouldn't be doing, about 100 indigenous people get together with their sticks and pressure the group to leave. Or if something bad is committed, they basically hold those actors accountable. A similar process is seen with the palenqueros, which is the black communities in the Bolivar department, also with these guards. Why these guards and not the police? Well, because in Colombia, you've had really bad history of the public forces being involved in the violence, a lot of distrust with them, or they have fear of interacting with these communities because they could have reprisals due to one of the groups affected. So I think this is a very important history that is now and still is ongoing. So now we're in the so-called post-conflict. We're really in the post-accord phase because security remains a major concern in Colombia, not so much from the part of the FARC, and less so now with the ELN that just signed a ceasefire, but more from the successor paramilitary groups and other criminal groups that continue to operate throughout the country and see many of these communities and these people as a major affront because of their high profile, because they're the ones who are going to be presenting cases in the transitional justice, because they're the witnesses and what have you. And so right now, I think it's very important that the world doesn't lose attention to what is going on in Colombia. It's important for there to be visibility of what's going on. You can say that very positive things have happened, but there needs to be work in order to consolidate that. And also, these folks need that political protection so that they can continue to move forward. Another issue is the issue of ethnic perspective. Colombia is not a monolith. It's a very diverse country with very different regional tendencies and different ethnic perspectives. And also, it's a country that is always praised because of the integration of gender in its peace accord, but actually getting that gender perspective implemented on the ground will need a lot of work. So these groups are going to be important in the reconstruction of memory of what happened, reconciliation, and in strategies to prevent the violence from starting again. It's important for them to also bring a lot of this knowledge to other countries in other communities in the world. Since it could be a source of knowledge that is useful to other communities. It's also very important that organizations that accompany them, like Peace Brigades International or Fellowship of Reconciliation, these are internationals that basically physically accompany these communities and report about their situation internationally, continue to receive funding to be able to work. And lastly, that, like I said earlier, that the international community really monitor and encourage Colombian institutions to respond to these situations and to incorporate the recommendations of these communities moving forward.
Thank you so much. I say I really appreciate the additional texture you gave to this idea of a community being organized and what that means within the Colombian context. And also you provide a perfect segue to our next speaker, Steve, because you talked not only about Colombia, but the juxtaposition of international law and norms. So take it away, Steve.
So I know it's the time is moving on, and we want to have room for discussion. So I will be effusive in my praise and brief in my remarks. So I join in the culture of gratitude that Oliver spoke of. It was really just wonderful to be part of this community, and nice to be back just 12 hours after I left, and to be part of this panel in particular.
We missed you.
Yeah, no, I know it's been a terrible separation, but good we're back together. This isn't about me. It is about a really interesting piece of work, and very impressive in its scope, and useful in challenging us to think about how the experience of Colombian civilians asserting their autonomy and helping to protect their own families and communities might become a model for other parts of the world. And it's interesting that you alluded to those norms, Carla. I was just struck by Jimena's presentation about the role that IHL has played in sort of providing a sort of neutral language for arguing the case for the protection of these communities in a world where one hears an awful lot about the degradation of IHL norms and can sometimes emerge from conversations with a sense of futility when talking about the role that IHL plays out there, to understand that just how important that it has been for these communities is really, to me anyway, a nice sort of shot in the arm. I guess I was asked to speak to the broader question of, applicability beyond Colombia because of the experience I had in the last administration working on atrocity prevention policy at the National Security Council. Where I helped to organize and chaired a body called the Atrocities Prevention Board that was focused on protecting vulnerable civilians all around the world. The sort of premise for that work, which is that the United States has a strong national interest and a moral responsibility for preventing atrocities against civilians, even in countries where we don't have traditional strategic interests or economic interests, is one that's gained quite a bit of currency over the last 2 decades. The emphasis found recognition in the national security strategies, the Bush and Obama administrations, the bipartisan Genocide Prevention Task Force report, which was co-authored or co-sponsored by USIP, and the Mass Atrocities Directive that President Obama issued in 2011 and a 2016 executive order. And I believe it's still a concept that has some currency in the current administration, although they're not as vocal about it. Those documents, the directive and the executive order, continue to be operative. So the United States government is in the atrocity prevention business, but of course, aspiring to prevent atrocities and actually preventing them are 2 very different things. What we found in the Obama administration was that by organizing the U.S. government to keep an eye on flashpoints and emerging crises, and by committing to treat these crises as priorities, even where traditional U.S. strategic and economic interests were not at stake, we could make a difference. That this was mostly the case in countries that we might otherwise have looked past as a government, the Burundis and the Central African republics. And sometimes success in this space was a fairly thin gruel and involved helping to freeze a crisis at bad rather than watching it slip into conflagration. But the experience was generally affirming in the sense of giving the sense that focused effort could actually be worthwhile in terms of helping save lives. That said, there were real limits that we found in this model for prevention. We saw in Libya that throwing every collective response tool in the UN toolkit to meet an atrocity situation wouldn't necessarily guarantee that a stable country would emerge on the other side. In Syria, conversely, we saw that if the international community failed to muster a collective response, it would even look worse. So to come back to the book, Resisting War, we live in a world where I think the United States government and other like-minded governments do see their interest in preventing atrocities and protecting vulnerable civilians all around the world, but are also very much in the market for new and better tools to help meet these objectives. So what does the book tell us about how to do this? I actually walked away with 3 broad points. First, and I think most self-evidently, there is a tendency, I think, for policymakers in a big government like the U.S. government to focus, when they're thinking about prevention, on tools that give it leverage over potential perpetrators so that they don't engage in abusive behavior. And that's, of course, often necessary, but what I think Oliver's book is very useful in reminding us is that we need to be looking at the potential victims as well and thinking about how can we help them provide and be a bulwark against abuse. We need to be thinking about the benefits of helping communities to organize, to use their moral and reputational leverage, to provide each other with early warning, and that was something that we heard about civil society doing some terrific work on back during the counter-LRA efforts during Joseph Kony's heyday. Also, and Amanda alluded to this, gathering evidence that can be used for sanctions designations and prosecution if there is violence. This is the kind of work that's probably best done well in advance of a potential crisis. For example, if there's a flashpoint election on the distant horizon that leaves a chance to engage and organize at the community level. Second, a somewhat tangential point concerns the role that vulnerable civilians can play in shaping the national debate around tools of atrocity prevention. Folks who follow this field know that the U.S. government places an enormous emphasis on accountability and the idea that perpetrators of the worst crimes known to humanity can't be allowed impunity, but our rhetoric, the government's rhetoric, frankly, often outstrips reality because perpetrators live in countries that don't cooperate with or support accountability efforts. To give one example, Omar Bashir, a fugitive for international justice and leader of Sudan, too easily travels from country to country in his neighborhood. Neighboring governments are either hostile to the accountability or agenda or don't want to turn on a neighbor or some such. But those kinds of attitudes really need to change if we want the accountability agenda to achieve all that it promises to achieve. And I think that's only going to happen if there's a grassroots effort grassroots support for accountability. It doesn't have to be the International Criminal Court being invited into every single jurisdiction, because I know there are sensitivities around that. It could be a regional or a hybrid court, so long as it's actually an independent and impartial forum where people can be brought to justice. The bottom line is a useful expression for civilian autonomy, in my mind, one that I would like to see encouraged would be to insist that those who commit mass murder are not going to get away with it, even if they have high office. The last point, Oliver's book is very careful, I think, not to overclaim for the impact of civilian autonomy in terms of managing and mitigating violence. In some communities, you registered a 25% diminution in violent deaths, which is nothing to dismiss. It's saving that number of lives is very significant, but it's also not a panacea. And of course, the book also notes that as conflicts escalate and become more protracted, this mechanism becomes less effective. So this is just a reminder that when we think about atrocity prevention, we need to be in a compound state of mind. How do we empower civilians to do more? And how do we mobilize community opinion around accountability? And how do we generate more effective leverage against perpetrators? And what do we do when the UN fails to support collective action, et cetera? That challenge is sufficiently big and complex and varied that we can't afford to focus on one approach to the exclusion of others. So again, thanks to Oliver for a stimulating read, and to my panelists for this great discussion. And I guess I turn it back to you, Carla.
Great, thank you. Great set of issues, and I wanted to actually first turn back to the group and ask about this 25%, because we started, and Oliver, you said there was 25% less violence in these communities that were organized, and then we had various discussions about organization, whether in Colombia or elsewhere, and I'm curious the extent to which you view the organization as something that was derivative of historic or traditional or customary norms within these communities, or whether this was a kind of organization that could be imposed from outside through capacity building or training, or the guarantee of authority to a community from an international organization or from a central government, so that we can then kind of think about, within that broader context, how you get to that diminution in violence.
Thank you, everybody. I'll take the first stab at this question. So the key question is, where does organization come from? And I think there are a lot of sources. I think in a number of communities, they've had histories of cooperation, either in Colombia or elsewhere, in part because of absence of the state, but in part because of different problems they had to deal with in providing collective goods. But the real question is, can they be imposed? What are they? What are the sources of organization? And actually, one of the sources that I saw in Colombia and as well in other countries is actually histories of violence. And so violence can be thought of as having two effects. It can harm organization, but it can also stimulate organization. And so I think, thinking about those conditions is really important. I go into it a little bit in more depth in the book, but I think there's an argument to be made that violence, in some cases, actually stimulates cooperation to then go and address violence. And actually, I think Mauricio's book shows this quite well, where peace movements were a reaction to, in many cases, to violence. I think some of the examples in my book actually speak quite well to international efforts to assist communities that want international assistance and that want to organize, as well as local level and Colombian government efforts to help organize communities. And so the example of the priest who saw the church roof collapse, I think, is one example. The U.S. Peace Corps was involved in Colombia for quite a while. I think we actually have some former volunteers who were involved with that work at one point, and they were also a key source of bringing external expertise to help people get organized. And sometimes I think people just they want and need a catalyst, and in those cases, I think international support is helpful. They can also share ideas and strategies, and then the community can decide for itself how it wants to proceed with those. I'll limit my remarks there and let the other panelists jump in, because in fact they were quite involved as sources of helping communities come together. So.
Well, I will say that it's true that there is a reduction in violence in some contexts, but obviously there is a combination of factors, a combination of elements that made this possible. Because you could find communities that in similar situation, but without organization or without territorial control or without other factors, they face a critical level of violence, and it depends in many cases of the armed actor. It's not it's not unknown that near 70% of the killings during the conflict were responsibility of the paramilitary groups. They were really, and normally they use massacres, no selective killings, as tend to use the guerrilla groups. And you can find this in different places. And depending on this, people are able or not to negotiate this and to find a way of managing the situation with these different armed groups. But I think it's very interesting that Oliver can find in a historical period and making a correlation that this reduction of violence is true when there are organized communities able to manage the relationship with the armed groups in other level, and not only in a very reactive level, but they have some space for negotiating and dealing with these complex actors. And I think this is what is possible to find, and there are space for self-protection and space for autonomy, but this is not a self-evidence. In the sense, it's not that always could be in this way. It's a possibility, but depends on how the communities work this and sort this out, and they can resolve always in a very complex relationship with the armed groups. And I say they move in a gray area, and it's not a perfect relationship. It's not always the same case, but it's a possibility that you find in a very concrete cases.
Yes, I would agree with everyone here that this is not a panacea, and it's not something that necessarily always works. It's also something that requires a lot of effort in terms of sustaining. It has to happen with an organized political response, with an international response, with at times a judicial response, for it to really have an effect. Is it something customary from history, or is it something that can come from the outside? I mean, I think it really depends on the communities you're talking about. When you're talking about indigenous communities, or the Palenque, which is the free black state in Bolivar, that resistance came historically from ancient times before and during colonialism. With other communities in rural areas or displaced communities, you've seen that it's a reaction to the violence. But to give an example, so in the Curva do community in the Chocó, you have a situation where lands were illegally taken over by paramilitary groups, and multiple oil palm companies have planted their operations in collectively owned Afro-Colombian lands. And there you have seen that these communities have been able to sustain themselves because there's been a judicial response. There are 13 basically company owners and investors being investigated, and several have been arrested for their links to paramilitaries and for having caused displacement. While you have the Yurumangui community, another Afro-Colombian community in the Valle del Cauca area, that basically decided that coca was the main source of conflict and insecurity in their area, and they banded together and decided to eradicate the coca. And there, the response of the state was really to do nothing. And you saw that there were reprisals right away against them by the FARC at that time for, ripping up the coca. And so, I mean, I really think it's a very fragile thing that needs to be nurtured, and also depends on how much of a political response it receives.
Great. I have several more questions all lined up, but I wanted to turn the floor over to you all because I'm sure there are questions or comments in the audience. So we have microphones that will be passed around. If you have a question, please identify yourself and pose the question. We can bring them back up to our experts. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jory. I'm a PhD student at University of Maryland. From reading your work and other people's work, I've seen that sometimes this civilian resistance comes from a single person, potentially a priest or another religious figure, a shaman, and sometimes it's much more of these community organizations. How much have you seen one versus the other, and have you noticed that one's more successful when confronting rebel groups?
Interesting question. So this is a tricky question. What comes first, the organization or a leader of that organization? You see both, but I think it's more likely that you'll get leaders from communities that are organized. It often takes someone to organize it, but I think that leaders are more effective. Good leaders are more effective when they have the backing of the community, and I think the quotes from the FARC leader and the paramilitary leader suggest that backing is what makes the armed groups take the civilians into account, and it also makes it harder to just target a leader and disrupt the community organization. So where the organization is stronger, that's not a sort of solution, an effective solution in a sense for the armed actors to shut down that community. And so that backing, it's not just the leader alone, but actually that capacity to continue on. So.
If I may just, and get your questions ready, but I just wanted to key off of that because you all four of you talked about the need to build up organizational capacity, whether it's in Colombia or elsewhere. And Mauricio, you talked about building community resilience, and Oliver, you talked about investing in civilian peacemakers. And I'm curious if you all, or Steve from elsewhere, have certain ideas with regard to what the investment is that leads to that organization to back up the leaders. How do you make those investments? Are there certain keys to success?
I will say it's very clear, at least for the most successful experience I have known in Colombia, they pass through a very long period of formation. They have a training, many times a church-based training in many regions, and then or in working together. And after 10, 12 years, 15 years of working in this, the situation of violence obligates them to act, and they are ready for this because they have been building this community capacity. So in the critical moment of violence, they have the capacity to react. And also something that Oliver said, to react despite some of them can be killed. And there are other people ready to take the lead and to move the movement forward. And this is very critical because in many cases, for example, in the case of La India that Oliver mentioned in the book, some of the leaders, the main leaders, were killed. But they can react positively and can reorganize themselves, and there were new leaders taking the lead. And you can also see this in some of the peace communities, and you find this in the indigenous communities, and you find this in many cases, but they have a very long history of training, formation, preparation, and organizing themselves. It's not a 3 days workshop and they are ready for this. No, it's a very long process, and it's a way of finding hope in the midst of a very difficult situation.
I would just add that in terms of what type of formation and so forth, I would ask the communities themselves, or often in the case of the communities we work with, they ask for what they think they need at the time. And just like Father said, it's something that is often stronger in the second or third generation after going through periods of starts and tries and tribulations and seeing what really works for them in that situation. What is interesting is this Compass group that has brought together these different communities, and they've started doing like self-capacity. Like one community that went through this in Putumayo is now doing it and teaching another community in another area what they learned and so forth. But I think more than anything, the investment needs to be something that is thought through with them and seeing what they need.
And I mean, I have the sort of least direct experience, I think, with these communities of the folks up here, but when I was looking through the book, what the memory that was evoked, and I mentioned it in my remarks, was some of the work that Invisible Children and some of the other NGOs did in Uganda and the DRC on early warning back in, I think it was 2010, 2011, 2012, sort of coming to communities and saying, look, we know you have a problem. Here is a capability that we can give you that will help you protect yourselves. So I think there is a role for bringing certain kinds of well-tailored solutions to a community and saying, we'll teach you how to use this, and it'll give you a measure of protection.
Hi, thanks. Jenny McAvoy from Interaction. I think one of the things that a number of you have actually touched on is the nature of the relationship between the armed group and the community. And that seems to be a really influential and even decisive factor in the degree to which a community is able to influence the armed group. I wonder if you can take that a little bit further. And did you see or have you seen situations where the armed group or armed force is distant and feels no immediate sense of moral, legal, or political affiliation or obligation towards the affected population, and therefore, how does the community adapt? And are there community strategies which you have seen to be effective in that kind of situation? Thanks.
And I think what we'll do is take a couple questions and then circle back. And I don't want to be accused of bias to this side of the room. So, Andrea, if you could help me out. Oh, okay, great. Here and here. Go ahead, Shaska.
Hello, my name is Shaska Byerly. I'm a fellow here. I have a question for Father Mauricio, and it builds upon a comment that he had made earlier today, in which Father, you were speaking about, in your experience, the linkages between corruption and the civil war, the violent conflict in Colombia. And what struck me was what you said, that a lot of the community organizing and the community, organizing to protect themselves also had to do with accountability. And I wonder if you could just elaborate on that a little bit, please.
One more right here.
Hello, my name is Nastasia Stipo. I've been working with the International Peace and Security Institute on the Americas program. I focus on reintegration process in Colombia, and my question is pretty simple, do you see a difference in accepting the reintegration of ex-combatants in these communities that were more organized? Or any difference, or similarities, et cetera? Thank you.
Who'd like to go first?
Just to make it different?
Yeah.
Okay, in terms of moral legal affiliation towards the affected population, this is just not with a great study with evidence behind it. It's just from experience, having worked in Colombia many years. I saw that in cases of the guerrilla groups, what was a factor was their reputation in different areas because of the fact that they wanted to win over populations or recruit different populations. When it came to paramilitary groups, it was really the visibility. Are there going to be consequences? Is this going to be a big international outcry that's going to force the Colombian government to investigate such an area, so then that person may actually be held accountable for whatever they're about to do. So, I think those were different. What I did notice, however, over the years and became a big issue during the peace process is that none of the groups had any sort of affinity with Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities in respecting their autonomy. And that became a major bone of contention between those groups and the FARC in particular. And the groups that we worked with worked very hard to organize themselves to change that around and turn that around and get themselves included in the process. And while there have been some successes, like an ethnic chapter and so forth, there's a long way to go getting that actually implemented. In terms of reintegration, I've seen a lot of rejection from these communities. They don't want any of the former FARC combatants around them. Why? Because those groups have committed atrocities and problems in their area. However, I've seen also the willingness in terms of indigenous groups to do healing processes and take some of their traditional practices as a way to cleansing that in order to, get past it.
A few comments related with the relationship between armed actors and communities. I'm seeing that something that is very critical is what is the level of autonomy communities can negotiate with the armed actors. And this depends on, to one extent, the armed actors feel that the communities could be a threat for them or not, or could question the control they have over the territory. To put an example, one of the most amazing leaders I had met in my life was Edwin. He was member of the peace community in Natividad de Maria in the Atrocity River. And but he had the crazy idea of having a project working with youths in order to prevent them to be recruited by the armed actors. But this was a sin in a context of violence. And both for paramilitaries and for the guerrillas. At the end of the day, he was killed by the guerrilla, by FARC, because he was going to the communities doing workshops and training youths in order to offer alternatives in this regard. But this was critical in that context, because for the armed groups, the possibility to recruit new members was a key issue in that context. So you find this in a way that is necessarily for the communities to find a way of managing and not in some way not questioning the control of the armed group, but finding the way of making a possible space for living together in some way. So in all these cases, there is always a room for negotiation, always. And some people feel, well, how are you going to negotiate with a paramilitary group, or how are you going to negotiate with a guerrilla? Well, people have to negotiate because they are living there and they have these armed actors there every day. not only for a short period of time that you go there and you stay with the communities. So they have to find a way for doing this. And I think this is a very complex, and something that, to say a last word in this point, is something they need to analyze and to have the capacity to understand what is the context. And to one extent, they have the capability to manage and to move in this context, this specific context and situation. Because maybe today is critical to challenge the armed actor, but in other circumstances it's possible. And it's critical that people have the capacity to discern this, to find if it's this or not possible. And they have to be very wise in analyzing the concrete context. In relation with corruption and civil war, I feel, at least in the Colombian case, it's clear that the armed groups, all of them, need a lot of resources if they want to keep moving the war. And this is a very critical point. So it doesn't matter if these resources come from drug trafficking, if they come from illegal mining, if they come from properly corruption, or using the resources of the state that they do in many of the regions in Colombia. The armed actors use resources for education, for health, and other things. So the point is they need to do this in a continuous way if they want to keep the momentum of the confrontation, because they need resources for having people, they need resources for arms, for ammunition. So this is a critical point, and for them there is no ethical standard related with this. And in many cases, the corruption corrupt the same armed groups, because some people are within the groups feel the opportunity and try to use this money that they receive, and there is no control. And you have seen, I remember a few cases in which a leader of a commander of the guerrilla leave with a lot of money, and because, well, this was an opportunity, they tried to find a way of this. And regarding the reintegration process, I think it depends on the type of community. In general, people that have lived different and difficult situations of violence are more open to process of reintegration and also of reconciliation. You can see, for example, for the referendum of the peace agreement, where this referendum had more support. Well, it had in a more conflicted regions. You have the example of Bojayá. Bojayá was a municipality where, in a confrontation with FARC and the paramilitary groups, FARC sent a cylinder, a gas cylinder as a bomb, and they killed 100 people in a church. And this community voted 95% in favor of the referendum. They say we have to support the peace agreement. But in other regions that didn't suffer with the conflict, they don't support the peace agreement. You have this paradox. So in many cases, these communities are more open to find spaces, and in some way they have learned how to negotiate with different actors and have to find a way of living together. So it's different to have this, but there are cases in which, without having some justice and some reparation, it's very difficult to do this. if the victims don't feel that they in some way find a way and are recognized as victims, it's very difficult to accept that a demobilized actor that arrives to the community with some support of the state, can live with that.
I'm going to turn very quickly. Steve wanted to say something, and I'm going to give Oliver the last word.
This is just Jenny's question. Provoked a similar question that I had. Oliver, maybe when you're summing up, you can address it. But the impression that I had was that one of the ways that these communities drew closer to the armed groups was to create these investigatory mechanisms, which were basically self-policing mechanisms to flush out collaborators, and that they were offering a benefit to the groups to some extent. I mean, that's an uncomfortable dimension to all of this, and I'm sure it's very uncomfortable for these communities. But it seemed like it was something that you highlighted as being a prominent feature of some of the communities that were most successful in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think overall the relationships between the civilian population and the armed groups can vary quite a bit from place to place, and so some of the findings are really sort of some of the average findings, but you have cases where communities are essentially co-opted by armed actors, and you have other cases where there's sort of a blurrier relationship. You have cases where the communities sort of demand or acquire a reduction in violence by reaching some kind of cooperative arrangement with the armed actors to police their own communities. I'll just have a couple of comments on the different questions here. I'll be quite brief because I know we're about at time. But in terms of the reintegration question, what I've seen is that in other research, actually, that more organized communities seem to have more offerings, social participation offerings for ex-combatants, and so you see actually higher levels of ex-combatant social participation in those communities, although I think Jimena's right that this can also vary quite a bit from community to community in terms of what kinds of violence was committed and what the attitude is of the community toward the ex-combatants. One interesting thing that I've seen in several communities, including the Peasant Workers Association, is they actually, through their ability to negotiate with armed groups, negotiated certain demobilizations of rebels and basically facilitated and guaranteed their exit from the conflict. So that's kind of an interesting positive thing, and as Jimena mentioned, we see that among indigenous groups and in other communities. In terms of corruption and accountability, one of the things that these communities often do is either, as Jimena also indicated, they fight, for example, the coca economy, or they try to stay away from the coca economy, at least in the case of Colombia, and you see this in some other conflicts as well. One of the ATCC leaders said, he who is involved with coca is not to be involved in the organization, and so they kind of try to draw these bright lines between people in the conflict and out of the conflict. And then finally, just sort of returning to the final question I think Jenny was hinting at, and I think Steve mentioned before, sort of what are the conditions for generating this protection? Can you do it when armed groups and communities have distant relations or few incentives to cooperate? Can communities protect themselves in the threat of higher level or more aggressive forms of violence? And I think the answer is yes, but again, some of the effects I've talked about are kind of average effects, but one of the things that we've seen is that in some cases, communities can stem massacres. The Peasant Workers Association was founded in the midst of very intense violence, and so I think that's an example where even in quite intense violence, you can have violence-reducing effects by organizing. And then finally, sort of addressing the situation in Colombia today, the current situation involves what are known as criminal bands, or BACRIM, which are, in many cases, former paramilitary groups who have gone criminal. And some of the main effects that I see in my research are a greater influence on reducing violence among actually the paramilitary groups, less detectable, but still present with guerrilla groups. And I think it's because in often cases the guerrillas were closer with communities in some ways, or have fewer incentives to commit as much violence. And as Mauricio mentioned, the paramilitary has actually committed, according to indicators, most of the violence in the conflict. And yet there's where you see sort of these more violent groups, you actually see reductions conditional on community organization. And yet this became much harder when these groups went criminal, because they had fewer ideological motives, and peasant worker leaders say there were fewer incentives for those groups to actually negotiate with the community, or there were just fewer figureheads to negotiate with. So they would say, who can we negotiate with within the criminal bands if they don't want to talk to us? And so that's actually a challenge. Some communities have found ways to actually negotiate security with those groups, but interestingly, you see that there's an example from Mozambique where the Renamo movement demobilized and became more criminal, and civil society movements there also had more trouble negotiating with those elements. And so in terms of the strategies, I think the internal management strategies are sort of the covert strategies that communities use, where they're actually managing their own populations. They're developing early warning. They're keeping people from supporting or being recruited into the armed groups are actually the things that are most effective. But again, this is a question that requires more research, and so hopefully that's what this event stimulates. And so with that, I'll wrap up, and thank you.
Great. Please join me in thanking all of our panelists, and especially Oliver Kaplan on publication of this great music.